Oh, okay.
Okay, and then I'm going to share the screen. So, we thought you all told us the first time we met what your area of interest was, and everybody's gotten that far. So we thought we'd start with just a little discussion. How do I take that area of interest and what I'm interested in focusing on and kind of describe it as a research problem, and then come up with a purpose and a specific research question and, if appropriate, hypotheses. So that's what we're going to do today. And I have to start with thanking Terry, and maybe Casey Clevenger contributed to some of these slides, and then I added some from Dr. Nancy Lowe, and then some of my own. So you have a hodgepodge of ideas about this. Hopefully that makes sense. So let's see if I can get it to go down.
So the arrow's not working?
There we go.
There it goes.
Okay, so if we talk about a research problem being an area that you're interested in, usually there's some kind of concern you have about it. And there's a kind of gap in the knowledge that you have around what the solution to that problem is, or that gap. And so you have to kind of describe and explain, and sometimes involves predicting what you think is going to happen in order to improve practice. So as you start to pull your literature, which Terry's going to describe in just a minute as pulling all the relevant literature, you're going to really, I think at this phase, bring in all the information about what is this problem, what could a potential solution look like, how did people measure whether or not that got better, and what's all the possibilities about how I might approach this. So I usually start my search pretty broad. And I don't know about you guys, but I usually go a little bit broader. And then this is a little stair-step description that Dr. Nancy Lowe came up with, just talking about the different types of knowledge that you can generate for a practice problem. And it starts with exploratory, and that might be, if we don't really even know that much about a problem, we may want to just describe the problem and the relationship of the different things that might influence the problem. And as you start pulling the literature, you'll see sort of what we call the state of the science, where the science is in that area. So an example of an exploratory or a descriptive study that I saw this past week with one of my master's students, she's interested in how screen time affects kids, little ones, infants and toddlers, language development. So she really wanted to look at, if we limit screen time, so the AAP says limit it to less than half an hour, but does that really make any difference, or is that just our best guess? So that science around that area is still pretty new, but just this week, a new article came out that's pretty exploratory, but it looked at comparing parents' self-report time of how much screen time the kid gets. So that's not a great measure, but it's a beginning. And it did actually say that there was a relationship between screen time and speech delay. So that's just an exploratory thing. It was cross-sectional, parent report, and then just looking at how the kids, they did 2 different measures of language. But that's not a randomized controlled trial where you're trying an intervention. It's just looking at cross-sectional, these were surveys and then observations of the kids. So that's an exploratory kind of research study. And then there's descriptive, which might just be describing the problem, which is what we did early on with like the Ebola stuff. people were just describing what happened in these women who were pregnant and had Ebola, and some of them had problems and some of them didn't, but we were just describing it because that's where the nature, the state of the science was then. Then experimental and quasi-experimental are studies, and your randomized control trial is kind of considered your gold standard, because then you can really answer the question, did this make a difference or didn't it? But lots of times in nursing, we have to go with a quasi-experimental, so maybe you can't randomize, maybe it's not ethical to do a control group. You have to offer the intervention, so then you do a pre-post. So all that kind of stuff can play in there. And then you might have a multi-site randomized trial. And then once we find like something works, we know this is the answer, how does it work in practice? So in the real controlled setting of the University of Colorado and our labs and all of that, we can have this gold standard clinical trial that really works. But then when we try to put it into practice out in the community, we don't know what's going to happen. I like to use Terry's stuff as an example. So her diet, you provided the food to them, right?
Right. Yeah, so we have a nutrition program, right, where in all of our studies we provide all of the food to the mothers. But I think what Bonnie's getting at is that the next step of what I'm going to have to do is, because that's kind of the best case scenario, and I think we all know if you just tell people to eat something, it likely won't happen. Or maybe it will, or maybe it won't, and how you measure that. So the next step of my next challenge will be, if I prove kind of the concept, getting it out into the real world and seeing how it really works in clinical practice.
So would people even make the
do
diet?
They like it?
Would they eat it? How would that work?
Yeah.
And then the next step is evidence-based practice. So there's all this knowledge out there, but then how the heck do we get people to use it? And you all can think of examples of that every day, where we've known for a long time what to do in pediatric care, and people aren't doing it. So that, I think, just gives you a little bit of an idea of kind of the variety of approaches to the question. And I think this is all based on, once you start pulling the literature and you see what we know, what would be the logical next step to extend what we know. And then Madeline's going to talk to you about the qualitative research. So both your exploratory and your descriptive studies can have qualitative pieces. This descriptive level 2 is usually the correlational or ex post facto or regression model. So as you're reading, you're going to kind of see where in that level of evidence things are. The effectiveness usually looks at, does it work? So it's still the efficacy in the real world, but then both utility and cost benefit. So if it's either something that people won't do, or it costs so much that it's ridiculous to even propose it. So for example, we have pretty good treatment for transmission of HIV to infants in pregnant moms, but it's totally not available in Africa. So it's just not cost effective in that country. So so they look at other types of stopping the transmission. And you may have heard of, so does HIV go through breast milk?
Yes,
Anybody know?
it does.
So there's a creative nurse researcher at UCLA a number of years back who said, so these moms shouldn't be breastfeeding, but we know breast milk is really good for kids. And they don't have formula. These are poor people in a country that don't have access. So you let the baby starve, or do you breastfeed, or what do we do? So she came up with this really creative idea to have the grandparents who are HIV negative, so the grandmothers breastfeed the infant. And I'll be darned, it worked. So if you ever,
Yeah,
if you,
how that happens.
well, remember that their grandparents are probably younger than I am.
They all have 10 children.
And they found that if you've ever lactated, if you've ever breastfed a baby, if you start nursing again, your milk escapes.
I just heard that. Okay, I'm sorry.
So
This is a little
You have to
crazy.
understand too, like they breastfeed for well over a year, and then they,
Yeah.
I mean, they have anywhere from 5 to 10 babies, and so the amount of hormones that they still have in their body, like, I can tell you, there were breasts whipped out everywhere when we were in clinic, and
Oh my
you just get used to it. I
Yeah,
mean,
wow. Huh.
So they found that
Stop.
grandmothers could breastfeed successfully and it wouldn't transmit. If the grandmother was HIV negative,
Yeah,
then
right,
the kid
yeah.
wouldn't be
Then there's
exposed.
that.
So,
Yeah, wow.
yeah, so nurses are creative, right?
Yeah.
They're just creative. Let's see. Oh, and the evidence-based practice part, those are your meta-analyses, which I don't think any of you are planning to do. But so let's talk just a little bit about some definitions a little bit. And quantitative research is usually described as a systematic, controlled, empirical, amoral, public, and critical investigation of a natural phenomenon. So that's a lot of words, but some important. You want it to be systematic. You want it to be controlled if possible. It should be based on the science, so what we currently know. You could design a great study, but if it's already known, you're wasting your time, you're wasting the resources. So that's why the literature review and pulling all the relevant literature is so important. So Terry's going to go through that next. And then in nursing, we're really big about it being guided by a theory and hypotheses, so that you have pulled all this literature and you know what the relationships between variables are already known. And then what's the theory of how this might work? It just makes it a much stronger study. So we'll talk a little bit more about that too. So your process, you're going to start with a topic of interest, which you all came to us with a very well-developed area of interest. And then you want to look at the literature around any theoretical stuff around it, any practice stuff around it, any conceptual ideas, and then all the science, both qualitative and quantitative. And lots of times the qualitative is how we come up with the theory of that problem. Do you have anything you want to add about that, Madeline?
No.
Okay. So later. She's going to do something later. So what are the sources of the research problems? All of you have come up with yours based on something in your background that kind of sparked an interest, but clinical practice, you know, what keeps you up at night, what worries you, why do you do things this way, what if we tried a different way? Is there a better way? Is there a more cost-effective? Would a different approach be more acceptable to our families or the kids? And then you go and you gather all you can find about that. So literature, conferences, journal club, colleagues, just chatting with other people here. I know you're going to enrich the ideas that you have because there's so many overlaps. We were talking about, Eve and I were talking about that yesterday, like it's sort of exciting there's overlap between the different interests that you guys have in this group. So then you're going to get the unanswered questions from either the current studies being conducted or the literature of those completed studies and try to figure out why did this happen? And then what's the next logical question that I want to ask? Sometimes you test a concept of a theory or test a theory in itself, or it might be part of a national initiative or the hospital initiative, so it could be any of those kinds of things. So you're going to start describing sort of what you think this problem is, and you'll have a broad statement about the problem, and then you're going to refine it to a research question, and we'll give you lots of examples and help you refine yours. But your research problem usually documents what's the importance of this, what's the feasibility of doing something about it, what population are you going to try to reach, and the rationale behind that, and then the variables to be examined. And I'm going to pick on Eve for the example just because I talked with her mostly recently yesterday. So we're talking about, she really wants to do something around getting the nurses in her area to work sort of toward the top of the scope of their practice. And what currently happens with a lot of the nurses that have been there a long time is they kind of have fallen into a pattern where they do kind of med administration. That's pretty limited scope. So her population that she's decided to focus on is the new grads. And the new grads who are coming in who she's orienting anyway, who are kind of energetic, enthusiastic, she thinks will be more open to this change. So that's how all of that, so it's important, it's feasible, and she has a population where she thinks it might be more acceptable. Do you have thoughts about the rationale for why this is so important to you?
I mean, patient outcomes and improved patient care. I think that, you know, when patients are in Gary Pavilion on an inpatient site, they may be receiving services from a lot of people in the multidisciplinary team, but I wouldn't say that what the nurses are doing is remarkable in any way.
So it's really her goal to get things elevated to a different interdisciplinary. And the whole interdisciplinary thing is a big deal these days, so kind of exciting. And variables to be examined, she's just starting to pull the literature, but we found a couple of measures. Anything piquing your interest at this point around variables to be examined, or are you still exploring?
So that would be like the model that we talked about? No, not really. I mean, I think so, like cognitive behavioral therapy, is that?
Might be an intervention to try.
But that wouldn't be the same as a variable.
Well, so that's the other thing that we talked about a little bit, and we'll say more about this later, but as you're looking at these studies, read carefully for what did they think their independent variables were. If it's a quasi-experimental or an experimental study that you're reading about and not qualitative, what are the independent variables? So in my mind, I always like to create little cheater things to help me remember. So independent variable to me, I always think intervention. So if you're not doing an intervention, that doesn't help you much. But so if the independent variable was CBT or no CBT or CBT or individual counseling.
Yeah.
So that's your independent variable. And then your dependent variable could be the patient outcomes. And you were talking, or somebody was, about length of stay, or it could be satisfaction with care. It could be depression. It could be anxiety. Those are all variables. But she's interested in the nurse's practice. So it could be something like job satisfaction, how long they stay in their position. Those are the kinds of outcomes. So your dependent variable, I usually think outcomes. And we do a lot of intervention kind of research, so we think in those terms. But if you're interested in something else,
or
we can help.
Predict your variable.
If you're doing
this and seeing if it's related to that, right? It's this, not that. But okay, right. But it's the thing that you think might be predicting the outcome. So.
And we'll help you sort through that once you decide on what your method is. But as you're reading these articles and they're using this language, I thought it'd just be helpful to say, okay, what is that independent variable again? Mm-hmm. And what is the dependent? So your problem statement's going to identify a knowledge gap. What do we know? What don't we know? And what do I want to explore? And then defines the area of concern for the research. And that might be things like prevalence and importance, and sometimes it involves cost. And it should include the concepts that are part of the problem. So is it, are there various aspects of the problem that you need to be measuring? And what would it look like if this got better? What are the things that make up the problem? And it should be, usually needs a little refining, but you should be able to come to a pretty concise statement that covers your what you found in the literature. So the purpose statement is the overall goal of what you want to do, and it may or may not describe a direction of what you think. So, you know, if we said cognitive behavioral therapy would improve whatever it is, depression, anxiety, or whatever. So that usually you have a bit of an idea that there's a direction. But as Paul Cook always says, who's one of the stats people at our college, he says when you plan on your analysis, always do a null hypothesis and don't pick a directional hypothesis because it's more conservative, but we'll help you with that too. And then you want to narrow it down to the aims of the study. So what's your overall goal? What is it that you want to accomplish? And so those are your aims, and that should include your variables to be studied, your population, as we said, the setting, if you know, and it could indicate a design. And we'll help you with that language too. So if you're going to look at the differences between two groups, then the language is not explore, it's look at the differences. If you're going to just be looking at relationships between variables, you're not going to measure difference between groups, that's the language you want to use. So we'll help you with that too. But as you develop an approach to doing the study, the language that you use is important to help us understand and whoever the reader of your work later to understand what you did. You should, the intent of your study should be pretty clear by this point. So as you can see from the upside down pyramid, you start with the statement of the problem, then your general purpose statement that comes up with your aims, and then the specific research question. And from the research question, if it's an experimental design, we should be able to then specifically state the hypothesis. You guys have anything you want to add? Okay. So here's a couple examples. The purpose of the study was to explore the effects of music therapy on blood pressure in children in an intensive care unit at a large acute care tertiary hospital. So the not acceptable is down below. The purpose was to prove that music therapy improves blood pressure. Oh, this one I forgot to change. It says in adult patients. I try to change everything to Pete's, but I missed that one. What are your thoughts about that first one?
Wait, the top one or the
Yeah.
not acceptable one?
Well, either one. Any thoughts about either one? What makes the bottom one not acceptable?
Biased. Yeah. You're starting out with the
Yeah. And we know that what we can do is gather evidence to support a hypothesis or to refute it, but we can't really prove.
Yeah, the word prove.
Yeah,
is the
don't
issue.
use that word.
Yeah.
So
That's what
remember, don't use prove if you're working with Madeline. All right, note to self. The top one, I think that word explore to me means that I'm not doing a randomized controlled trial. To me, explore means more looking at relationships or logistic regression or something like that, like what are predictors. So if I'm doing a randomized controlled trial, I might say the purpose is to,
Did you say determine?
Yeah, that's what I was just
you
gonna-
could say
yeah.
some other word that would, and determine would be perfect.
Mhm.
Determine the
Character.
effects.
Yeah.
That would tell us exactly what you're trying to
Yeah.
do. The word explore, to me, if you're doing an RCT, that just makes it a little confusing to me. But that's, those are kind of nitpicky things with language that will help you with. It just helps make it really clear to the reader by just that one sentence what you did. So if we said determine the effects, then you know the design already, or what should be the design. So here's some other examples. We conducted this study to investigate the effects of music therapy on blood pressure in children located in an intensive care unit at a large acute care tertiary hospital. What do you think about that one? Yeah, it's pretty clear. Yeah, pretty clear. So the aim of the study and then the objective in conducting. So if you were going to take that purpose statement, how would you make that into a research question with hypotheses? And you can make this up because I don't know how you measure all that stuff. Any thoughts? What would a hypothesis look like? We hypothesize that.
Remember, that's what you think will happen.
Children in an ICU. Might want to be more specific about what children. Anybody brave enough?
Would it be that they would have a lower blood pressure after receiving music therapy?
Yeah, maybe that is. So you could have your patient population, the intervention is the music therapy, and then your expected direction with the blood pressure or normal blood pressure, whatever parameters. Yeah, good. All right, she travels the world and has the courage to jump right in. So here's an example of problem statement to purpose. And I'll just let you read through and see what you think. Can you see it, or is it too small back here? Okay. So what do you think? It's only a handful of sentences, but paints the picture pretty well, huh?
The only thing that stood out to me, I think it sounds good, the third sentence, or remember, pain due to chest tube removal can be severe and it appears to have a stronger, like, it's not a very strong statement.
Yeah,
Does it have a stronger negative emotional component?
Yeah, so you could say research indicates or research suggests. Yeah.
That's the only thing that stood out though. Is I felt like this
Yep.
was
So that convinces you this is a problem. We should do something about it. So here's some purpose statements derived from that previous problem statement. Take a look at those and see what you think. Oh, I think we're missing part of the. Oops. Sorry. Sorry, my phone's going crazy. Oh. I was trying to get the whole thing up there, but maybe I should leave. Okay. Determine the optimal treatment for decreasing pain and reducing negative emotions during chest tube removal is that fourth one. So, except now I think I'm not sharing it with. Too many buttons. Okay, which one do you think is the best? And why?
Those closely aligns with what the previous purpose was.
Yeah. So what's wrong with number one?
It was the purpose. Yeah. It's really solving.
We're not comparing to another postoperative pain, so that wouldn't work. And so 4 captures the real purpose, the real components better. So your research question really should outline the primary components that are going to be studied, and it guides your design. So it should tell us the method, the measures, the topic of interest. It should all be clear in there. And sometimes it helps to think about those in that PICO format. So who's my patient population? What's the intervention? What am I comparing it to, and what are my outcomes? Sometimes you have more outcomes, and sometimes it's a little more complicated than that, but think about it in those terms. And then when we think about quantitative research, we already said we're looking at least 2 variables and some relationship between 2 variables and how those variables relate to one another. So you can have descriptive or correlation studies that just describe the relationship between the variables, or you can have exploratory or experimental that look a little bit more in depth at the relationship between the variables, and they can influence then how one variable affects another variable. And that can be your predictor, or it can be kind of your outcome studies with interventions. So we already said the independent variable is either a predictor variable. It predicts or causes something to happen. And so an independent variable in intervention research is treatment, and dependent is outcome. So you think about a response or effect of the treatment. So when you go to define your variables, you're going to have a concept that you think is the outcome. So the kid feels better, but how are you going to measure that? So conceptual is going to describe the variable in general terms without reference to how it's going to be measured. So how the treatment affects the heart. Well, what about the heart? So is it the heart rate, the EKG, the blood pressure? Heart rate variability is a new thing that people are using as an outcome. So the operational definition is how you're going to measure it, and you'll have both. So we've already talked about this types of research objectives. It could be to describe something, to refine measurement of something, to explore relationship, compare groups. And so your final steps in outlining your researchable question, so you're going to clarify the objectives, you're going to tell us what the purpose is, and you're going to give us specific aims and a hypothesis. And you don't need to do it today, but as you're reading your literature, start thinking that way. Think about refining your question. How are you going to define the variables, and how are you going to measure the variables? Try to make your problem statement simple, clear, but complete. So that's a little tricky to find that fine line. And what's the relationship between at least 2 or more variables? Couple more examples. What are the characteristics of patients in an intensive care unit in a large tertiary care hospital? So what kind of research design is that? What are the characteristics? Could be qualitative. It's definitely descriptive. So it could be qualitative or a survey, but absolutely descriptive. You're absolutely right. And what is the association of music therapy with blood pressure? So looking at that language, what kind of design do you think we're thinking about?
Experimental.
Say it again.
Experimental.
What is association? Do you know what that is if you think about statistics? Correlation.
Yeah.
So
that's
experimental.
that's more your exploratory, or but again, it's the language, it's the association. So what is the effect of music therapy on blood pressure? That would be your experimental. And it's a simple word difference, and that's why we're going to have you really look and create these evidence tables that say, what are the variables and what did they do with them? What was the method? So that you get a little more of an idea of what's been done.
Good to jump in. No, thank you.
Yeah, and I love it when you have the courage to jump in. Yeah, that's right. They know what it feels like when everybody just sits there.
We know how to wait out the silence.
Yeah. Okay, a couple more examples. Does music therapy lower blood pressure more in adult patients located in an ICU or in a post-surgical cardiac patient before discharge in a step-down unit? Wow, that's a big, complicated one. All right, so what do you think? What's that one?
Oh, okay.
I think that's experimental. Right? Like
That is experimental.
RCT with
Yep.
study.
And these are the kind of studies I like. I don't want to ask just one question. So does the music therapy work pre to post in both groups? And then does it work better in one group or the other? We can help you design that too if you want to get crazy. Do multiple things. How about that last one? What do you think?
Experimental, because
Yep.
you're comparing two interventions.
Yep. Comparing two interventions. Perfect. So here's just a couple of examples on cardiac patients' problem statement to research question. So take a look and see if you see how they evolved. See how the last one got really specific and you know exactly what they're going to measure? So this is a good one to kind of have in mind as you're trying to flesh out your problem statement, your purpose, and your question. Any thoughts about that one? Comments? So hypotheses are having the courage to say, okay, I've read everything out there. Here's what I want to do, and here's what I think is going to happen. So it's a declarative sentence. It tells us the relationship between the variables, and where it's real clear on what you're going to test and if it's directional, what you think you're going to find. So what the intervention is, who it's going to be done on, and what the outcomes are. So causal hypothesis tell us the relationship and describes the cause and effect. And as we said, the null hypothesis sort of is how you do your statistics. The alternative is which direction you think it's going to go. And I think we're getting close. I think we're going to talk more about the statistics and all that in a couple weeks, so I won't go into much there. So your hypothesis is attempting to answer the research question or the purpose statement, so it's derived from them, written in a concise declarative statement, and it has the relationship or the non-relationship between the two variables. So use those examples. Let's look at those. So the null, there's no difference, and the direction, non-directional is.
For this one though, it just says like the mean will be different.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't really choose
not
a
picking us-
direction.
yeah.
So is that still
That's non-directional.
okay?
Mm-hmm. And
And sometimes you want things to not be different.
mm-hmm.
So if you're looking at safety and you say, well, we'll do this, but it's not going to be any more dangerous than what we're doing.
This is another example. And just a couple quiz questions and then I'll pass it off.
These are my slides.
Are they?
A lot of them. Yeah,
Just
but I just go ahead.
so caloric intake is related to weight. What is that an example of? Is related. So it doesn't say how it's related. So non-directional hypothesis. And how about oh, I just wanted to throw in here, you add the theoretical framework that helps you with the sampling, the measures, the procedure, and the intervention. And that's all going to come starting with your problem, and then your literature review, and then your question, then your hypothesis, your design methods, then it goes to the analysis, interpretation, and the application. So I think this is when I hand it off. So let me pull up your slides. Your slides.
I don't know, we're both not going to be here next time, so.
Yeah,
okay.
We need to both get in here.
Get ready to you guys want to get food? We should get.
Yeah, before it gets cold.
Yeah. Bonnie, should I just run it off yours or plug this one in, or?
If you want to, we could
But
still
we're
be
recording,
Zooming.
right?
Yeah,
Oh, that's
we
right.
could
Okay.
still be, if you want to just plug it in here.
Okay.
Shut
Okay,
this.
so why don't, go ahead and get some food while we're doing this.
Intermission. No.
Screen sharing has stopped. So we'll have to screen, once you get your Zen, we'll screen share.
Oh, okay. Oh, sorry. No, it's all right. Let's see. I'm not going through it all.
We should be
Yeah,
okay,
I'm
though,
not
still.
going
We
through
have
it all
till
though.
6.
There's like
Mine
20
won't
slides,
be-
but I was just gonna.
Mine won't be long.
Okay. I will.
Yeah, somebody had some really nice, I used to, of those examples, I used my undergrad class.
Oh, you did?
Somebody, yes, they had lots of nice pictures. Somebody went through that.
Yeah.
I didn't realize.
Sarah
it.
might have worked on it last year too.
Oh,
I can't
Sarah.
remember who did. You know, so Sarah could.
Whoever
Oh.
did it, boy, nice.
Oops. I'm sorry. I don't know what I did.
So you added to, it's funny how they all get.
Yeah, I didn't even give you credit. I didn't know they were yours.
Well, somewhere, yeah.
I did. Yeah, and some of Nancy's slides, because I thought it helps them understand.
Yeah.
Good salads and stuff.
How was your trip?
It was quite the adventure.
Yeah.
All 5 of us summited though, so
Yay!
yeah.
Boy, that's cool.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
And we had great weather.
Were you in the same place in the same clinic as last time, or did they move you guys, or does it
Well,
rotate around?
We stay in the same area and then go to different like rural villages for our outreach clinics.
Okay.
So I think we went to one place that was the same as last year.
Oh, okay.
And then we flew over to Tanzania to do Kilimanjaro.
Yeah, yeah. What'd you think? Was it really hard to breathe?
It wasn't as hard as I thought it was going to be. Diamox works wonders.
Yeah.
So, but it's crazy to be up 19,000
Yeah, wow.
plus feet.
Wow.
You're like you're at sea level now.
Yeah.
Yeah, it probably feels that way, huh?
Well, and they would check our saturations at night. They say that in order to be able to summit, your sats need to at least be above 60.
Oh my God.
Such a high
We
pressure.
thought was
Yeah.
quite
That's correlated with being
beneficial.
alive.
Oh
Yeah.
my God.
I was at least in the 90s up until every day before we summited, and then I was in the 80s. But I have a new appreciation for cardiac patients that like live in the 70s to 80s
Sure.
because you're just tired.
Yeah, right.
So
Oh, wow.
yeah, but it was beautiful.
Oh, man. That's great.
Don't think I ever need to do it again.
What did you say about doing it again?
I don't think I ever need to do it again.
Yeah, been there, done that.
Yep.
Yeah, it's bucket list.
Yep,
It's
exactly.
okay. Wow, that's cool.
And we started at 3 a.m. the day we summited, so we got to see the sunrise, which was really beautiful.
So you were doing it in the dark?
We start out, yeah,
Wow.
which it was kind of good to be
That's
in the
amazing.
dark, 'cause then in the daylight you're like, oh, this is a little scary.
Was there a language barrier between you and the Sherpas?
Yeah, most of them didn't speak English, but our guides all did,
Oh, okay.
so that was fine. The porters are incredible. They have like a full backpack on their back, and then they carry all of our stuff on their head. And then just like hop up the mountain. Like they were passing us, and yeah, they say it takes about 3 porters per person.
They take breaks in between groups.
Yeah, and it's they have 2 main busy seasons. We were the very end of this season, so it's starting to enter into raining season. So like we were our guides' last group that they were taking up, and so they'll be done until like June.
And where was it?
Tanzania, Mount Kilimanjaro.
Wow, that's awesome.
Well, we had a blizzard while you were gone.
I heard.
We had to
Yeah,
navigate, we had to navigate a lot too. We weren't hypoxic. The winds were 70 miles per hour.
But you didn't miss any class.
Oh, well, I'm still 300 plus emails behind, so that must be buried somewhere in there.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I'll start talking in a second, but I was gonna eat some salad.
How was the clinic part? You did that first?
Yeah, we saw 1,423 patients in 4.5 days.
Wow.
So, we had actually a bunch of medical consultants with us. And so they did this as like an outreach program for their organization. And with that, it helped to have so many non-clinical people that they were really great about keeping the flow of patients going really well. And we had a really good amount of providers that's the only reason we were able to see so many patients.
Wow.
So, yeah.
How do the patients know about the clinic? Is it open all the time, or is it just?
No, well, so they have a full-time clinic there, like in the main village that's near where we are. And then they have people that live and work there full-time, and they go out to these rural villages where we'll be going and build relationships in those communities and spread the word that we're coming. But we had one site that we had never been to before, and so it's always kind of
Tenuous.
a guess
Yeah.
of, are we going to have patients show up or not? And that day, especially as the day went on, like more and more people started showing up. Yeah.
The word spread.
So it's definitely really hard when you have to turn patients away and say that we can't see anymore. But you kind of you do what you can to see as many as possible, but you also have to be able to get home at a safe time. And
Yeah, right.
Did you see adults and children?
Yep.
Bonnie, what do I do with the screen, or do I just turn it on? I'm sorry. Or do I have to hit the screen share, or? Okay. Let's see.
Share and pick your screen.
Oh, there's me. Ooh, sorry. Wait, what do I do here?
Hit share, and then
Okay, why don't I see that?
you click on the bottom, and then
Oh, down here. Oh, I see. Okay.
and then pick your slides right below you,
Oh, I see. Okay.
and then
Okay.
Did you do your escape room with Libra? Go.
So
They were
did it
so
today.
excited
Did they
that
come back and talk about it?
I had them in class yesterday, and so they said, I think we get to do an escape room. I was like, you do. It's really exciting.
Yeah, they were so happy. I love new grads. I just wish we could inject their energy into grumpy people.
They're the only reason I was able to come to work yesterday after 48 hours of travel time to get home.
Yeah, they were super fun and excited and loved it. We like this over a lecture. Anytime.
Now I feel like I should have an escape room for lit reviews.
No.
But, you know,
It's kind of hard.
actually, I've never done one, so
I
I'm kind of,
haven't either.
you know.
There's so much fun. You should go do one. They're fun.
Yeah, I was actually telling my husband about your project and stuff. I'm like, what? He knows all about them because he works with teens. So he hears all about this stuff. But, okay, well, I'll start talking because I just wolfed down some salad. And so I hope that's okay. And so, Bonnie, the mic should be running, right?
Yep.
Is it? Okay, good. Sorry, I don't usually use the record button. So, hi, Amy. Okay, she's not here. Okay, so okay, I'm just really excited that you guys, now we get to like really get started, okay? And so the first task that we're asking of you, I know is a little bit looming. Yes, it's your research question, and it's all those things, but the lit review, I would argue, is very daunting. And I kind of know that because Kristen was emailing me, and if any of you were feeling like Kristen was, you're probably feeling like, okay, like how many articles am I supposed to read here? I just got 1,000 hits. Like, what do I put into? Okay, so yeah, exactly. I know I have those same questions. And so I just thought maybe that we would start with some primers. And I guess my disclaimer is that these are based on my lived experience. And any of you who know me, or the more that you get to know us, I actually live this stuff. I love it. Research gives me great joy. I said it at the first session, and I'm really just excited that all of you get to kind of get started in this, and maybe you'll love it as much. So just some things to get started, and already you've heard us say this, but I would argue that it takes real courage to ask. Sorry, it's the crouton. Okay, sorry, I'm okay. Well, that was not very powerful. What I wanted to say is I'm giving all of you so much credit because it really takes a lot of bravery and courage to ask the questions that all of you are doing by being part of the fellowship in your everyday practice. That's the way that things change. And so, the story that I like to tell is when I was a cardiac nurse in Dallas, Texas, I had questions. I had things, I could see things that I thought there might be a better way. And there were no nurse scientists. There was no support for somebody like me, quote, which I would argue, I think all of us in this room are kind of similar. And I often felt like I was just kind of out there by myself. And I was always the QI person back in those days. So that's one of the reasons why when Casey started the nurse scientist team here, at first when she came and sought me out and she said, well, I want you to do this. I said, what? And we talked about the whole thing. And then after I really thought about it, I thought back to when I was a cardiac nurse and I had a PhD by now. And I thought, you know what? I needed a me. So if I can be that, any of us are here for that reason, but I would argue that it really takes great courage. So the questions you're asking are hard. Okay. One of my mentors taught me, and this is one of the most important lessons I think I've learned in my research career, is that every good question leads to 3 more. So that's why, and actually he's right. Like I hate it when he's right sometimes, but I think he was right about this. But that's why if you have a book that you're keeping your notes in or whatever works for you, I have a book, I can show you my book. Write these things down because actually you'll find that you come back to them and often you answer your own questions, which is awesome. Or like I said, every good question leads to 3 more. Another primer, as nurses, I think that we have a very sacred position in that we understand the human experience of health and illness, whether it's families, whether it's the kids. And so I think that it's a great privilege for us to be able to ask the questions that really matter to people. And whether it's the nurses themselves or, like I said, or these families, it's really a great privilege. So I'm giving you a lot of credit. Be their voice. And I know that you already are, but now we can help you really articulate their voice and ask those questions that they can't ask themselves. My 4th primer is that, as you can gather from everything Bonnie said and everything we talked about even at the first session, informed interventions, I'm convinced, lead to better patient care. I mean, I probably don't have to convince you of that, but by the time you get through the fellowship, I want everyone, you to go back to your units and really just spread the good word. It's really true and it really works. We can help you get to the next level. And then I think I heard Kristen make a reference to the 7 habits of highly effective people earlier. I know, you're like, what? Okay, Kristen said, well, don't begin with the end in mind, because actually we were talking about directionality of hypotheses. But I actually would argue, just as Stephen Covey did in the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, that any good research study, if you begin with the end in mind, you will have a better study. And as you're getting into the literature, you're going to read stuff where they didn't begin with the end in mind. Nikki, we ran into that when we were publishing your paper. And we want to help you. We want to help you be better, right? No study's perfect, and there's always going to be limitations, and there's going to be a list of things but darn it, we want you to do it as well as it can be done. And part of that is really thinking and beginning with the end in mind. So, okay, so let's just talk a little bit more about literature review because it's overwhelming, okay? I think does everybody here have a master's degree? Okay, no, it's okay if you don't, but everybody's done some kind of lit review, maybe just to pop in, even if it's in like Google Scholar or something, which is actually another form of lit review. Well, I mean, essentially what we're asking, hear you hiccuping, essentially what we're asking you to do is based on your question right now, which it will become like the triangle, like Bonnie described, eventually. But right now it's this great idea. It's a population of interest, and it's maybe a potential solution that you've been thinking about, right? And so the review of the literature is really a very critical look and hopefully maybe it's the best lit review you've ever done that you can now do with us, to really critically take a look and see what's out there to figure out, where you even start. Okay, I mean, because that's the whole point. A lot of times what Madeline and Bonnie and I see is people will come to us with a QI project, and they've got this great thing, and I've already collected all these data, and we're like, well, where's your lit review? And I'm not making, but basically, well, what happened is, somebody said, we have to do this. And they missed the most basic thing. And I'm not faulting them. We want to help them be better with it, but we actually see that a lot. Okay. So this is a really important time. And I think it's really fun because it's a great way to really read about, okay, all of you picked a question, not just to pick a question, but because it matters to you. And nobody's going to sign up for an 18-month research immersion if you're not in it. I think that's fair, right? But so okay, she's with it too. Okay, so this is actually a great time to really get to read about the things you're interested in, okay? Assuming that you picked something that you're really passionate about. So this is the time where we really want to, you can go back and look through these things. We want you to be able to have the background that you need, really, really determine how important it is from a broader perspective because of what other people have been, thinking about and writing about. And importantly, carve out, as Bonnie mentioned, the gap in knowledge and the thing that you think you can contribute to help make this better, this problem. Okay. So there's some characteristics of a good literature review, right? And as you're reading, I want you to also pay attention to the ones that maybe aren't so good so that you can, contrast that and make yours on the level above that. A really good literature review is going to support what you're doing. It'll help you define or refine your research question, right? This will help you get into what do we know? What don't we know? I thought we knew that. I mean, this is the time to really help understand what those gaps are. And also, it's going to give you a chance to evaluate how good is the research that's out there, okay? And remember, every good question leads to 3 more. That's kind of that last bullet. It doesn't say it exactly like that, but I mean, a really good question is going to lead to more. And people often at the end of their research papers, when they're publishing, they'll say, well, we still have these questions. So those are actually things that you can pay attention to because they're often things that are kind of pearls for the field. If people are saying, well, we know this, but really there's still these other things that we don't know. So kind of in order, if you're an order person and you want to think about this, first of all, okay, this kind of gives you a framework, but I was telling Kristen, one of the things that I like to do first, if this works for you, you can also try it, is I try to find a really good review of the literature. And then I read it really carefully. And now, how do you define a good review of the literature? Like, okay, so I mean one that really, is pretty comprehensive, and you read it and you go, oh, yeah, this is good. Okay, and not only read it for the content, look at the references, see what the tables say, look at the figures. This is the review that's going to stay in your bag for the length of this project because you're going to keep going back to it. If you can find a good a good lit review that somebody else wrote already on your topic, that's actually a great place to start. And it'll help you, with your pyramid because we're still kind of at the top here in terms of narrowing. Okay. Yeah.
So along those lines, and I one of the first things I did when I read the initial beginning, I was like, oh my God, they already did what I want to do. And I was like, well, but then I read it and they didn't. I guess that's my question. Like,
okay.
When you already find a lot of stuff about what it is you're interested in, how do you know that there is a hole?
Well, first of all, I just want you to know that it's almost always been done before. Like that's the thing is, don't you guys find that? You think, oh, this is novel, I'm going to do it. And then, oh, someone already did that. Yeah. But that's always the face value kind of thing that you figure out. Actually, there's probably maybe a better way to do it, or there's still gaps, okay? And in terms of your question, how do you know that it's a gap? That's hard for me to answer like on the fly right now. Because really what it takes is a lot of time and reading across papers, and whether it's studies or review papers, after a while, it really will start to, you make a gestalt, right? And really, you will start to see where the gaps are. I don't know if that's kind of big picture right now, but essentially that's what you do.
Could be your population
yeah.
sample a lot of times.
Or maybe it works if they do it, but then how do you get people to do it?
Yeah, right. So, so this is, like I said, this is kind of a framework. Actually, I think this came from Casey a few years ago, but if you're an order person who wants to think through, gosh, how do I even get started? Plan ahead of time, read a lot. Okay, so this is kind of the time where you get to be a sponge. You don't have to be so committed. You know what your focus area is, right? But you don't have to commit like right this second to the directionality or the thing that you want to do. Take it all in. Like this is part of the process, right? And then we want to help you really analyze what you're reading. Okay, so I'll get back to that in a minute. And as you're writing, even as you're going through your writing phases, friends in the room, your mentors, us, like have people read it as you go. And, does this make sense? Or, because that's also part of the process. And by the way, if you're going to ask someone to read what you've written, whether it's a paragraph or a page or whatever, you don't want to give it to someone who just goes, ooh, okay, yeah, it's great. You want red markup. You want track changes, right? The more track changes there are, the more that means somebody cared enough to really make suggestions or say, I didn't understand that, okay? It's hard to hear. I mean, it actually is, especially when we're so, it takes a lot of time to do this stuff, but it'll be better. So it's part of the process. And then, of course, revising is kind of part of that. So I know this was Casey because she loved Calvin and Hobbes, but she still loves it. It's just that she's not here. So he says, do you have an idea for the story yet? No, I'm waiting for inspiration. You can't just turn on creativity like a faucet. You have to be in the right mood, right? I mean, what mood is that? Last minute panic. I mean, maybe, yeah, right? So maybe panic works for you, like if you get a little adrenaline going. But the point is, there's nothing fast about this, and you can't just turn it on and turn it off. So wherever she found that was cute. So here's a couple of types of literature review. You can do kind of a broad literature review across a number of things where you really do get to be a sponge. If you wanted to take a more systematic approach, and some people this is how they start out. They want to do a systematic review of the literature and publish it. Well, that usually is different from kind of the traditional literature review because you set criteria. You say, and you guys have seen this stuff in writing, I'm only going to look for articles in the last 10 years, only randomized controlled trials focused on this area with this outcome. Whereas a more traditional literature review, you can have a wider scope if you want. So that's kind of the difference with what we're doing. So, it would be helpful if you want to pick one of those approaches. Actually, either is okay. So you can pick one of those two approaches for your literature review. If you are one who uses a PICO question, I think that's a great framework. Kristen and I were talking over email the last couple weeks. I personally don't use PICO, but I'm old and I've been doing this a long time. But I actually think whether it's PICO or any of these frameworks that just help you think about the different components that you should be considering, I think it's a great idea. So if PICO works or, any of these, I'm not sure what's in the textbooks, but we just want to make sure that you capture the right components. Okay, and then we'll also give you some resources for the library that I'll mention shortly. So most people have a lot of questions, like Kristen did. Geez, how far do I go? How wide do I cast the net? I wish I had a definitive answer, but part of the fun is that I can't tell you that because all of you have complete academic freedom here in terms of your subject area, the things that you want to read about, okay, which isn't super helpful to start. But I will say this, if you start with, reading a couple of articles, as you read more, you'll start to know just over time what to ignore and what to pay attention to. I mean, I can't make it super easy because you actually just have to spend some time reading. and kind of taking notes. I'm one who writes all over the margins of papers. Yes, I still print out copies of PDFs. And I keep notes in like my book. Other people do great with electronic, whatever works, electronic note taking, any of those things. That will help you. But really over time, I bet you'll read 2 or 3 articles and already start seeing ways that you can start to make it more concise. That's just what happens when you're reading, You guys want to jump in, or Bonnie? Oh, I thought Bonnie was going to say something. Yeah. Importantly, we want you to pay attention to the types of information. So primary data definitely have a place versus a secondary data, or there's primary sources, secondary sources. And so if you've all done the CHCO training, that helps you rate the quality of evidence too. Is it somebody writing about, the 3rd time removed study, or is it somebody who actually did the study? You see what I mean? So those are some things that you can pay attention to. There's a lot of opinion articles out there, especially in nursing. Well, we think it should be this, but so we want you to pay attention to that. By the way, they're valuable, but is that evidence? Okay, yeah, so that's kind of the level that can help you also kind of narrow your scope and focus on the things that you want to focus on. So, here's just some more kind of primers about your literature review, which I'll let you take a look at, later as you're getting started. But one thing I wanted to call out is, I'm kind of guilty of this because I love PubMed. I live in PubMed. I'm very comfortable with PubMed, but there's actually more than one data source out there. There's Sonal. Madeline's laughing at me because she knows it's true about me.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, but so you get comfortable in one, but remember that there are different databases, and by the way, not everything is indexed in PubMed. So I'm kind of shooting myself in the foot by being so focused on it. I'm letting you know one of my limitations. However, we can help you, and the librarians here at Children's, they couldn't make it today, but they'll come maybe next time and introduce themselves. They can help you use the other databases that are available for your lit search. So in terms of casting the net wider at the beginning, feel free to use some of those other databases, because you'll bring in more than just what you would find in PubMed.
And I think,
No.
I don't remember what.
Oh.
So I put a request in with the librarians, and they actually did like a lit search for me. But through Children's, we don't have like access to every single one. So it's almost like easy to use because we have access, but like Ovid, like you have to have like a special login.
There were a few articles that I found too that I couldn't get access to, and I emailed the librarians, and then they sent me the PDF of the article. So they have,
Also, they're in the statistics.
they have extra,
Yeah.
like, oh, do you still have
Yeah, but did you
yours?
try the health sciences library?
So that link went away. Yeah, we used to be able to go
Oh, they
through.
did.
didn't you go to the library? Can you actually go there?
You can.
Nobody
Yeah.
does that anymore.
That's what we need to find out what happened with why you guys don't have access to the
We
library.
lost our, we used to have a separate login for children's employees, and that's gone away.
Huh.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
we need to ask about that.
We do
Yeah.
have like limited
Mm.
access if you go through Children's library. We don't have access to very much, so.
No.
We need to check on that, because I thought it was better.
Yeah, for a while
yeah.
we did. You'd go through the CU Health Sciences, and we had a separate login, but they took that away probably 6 months ago.
Okay, usually I'm sorry if I'm just missing something. Like usually I go to the health sciences website. I don't know if I can do it here. I can?
Yeah.
And then, here, wait, let me see if I can.
Just share the screen so
Yeah,
that
okay.
Amy catches it.
Yeah, here, wait, let
But
me,
you need a password.
Yeah, and that's what we used to have, a separate login and password for children's employees.
But maybe we do, if you have a POI number and say,
Oh, maybe.
oh, well, hang on. The POI number might
Try that.
solve that, yeah.
Because if you use C Health
Yeah.
email address when you signed up for it.
Uh,
Maybe the password, so maybe that's how you get
Oh,
access.
there you go. That's what you do.
Yeah. Because they do have, like, you might like CHCO.
Yeah, they have a lot of them.
Oh, this kills me. All right, let me just see here. Hang on.
Yeah, topic, then I'll go to Sinal.
Okay.
So do you know what databases the librarian uses for those?
Oh, she uses, they look across them.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
they put it, they probably look across 4 or 5,
Yeah.
depending on.
But you might want to say, would you
Yeah,
please
you might
add
say.
Sinal CHCO?
Yeah,
There's an education one called Eric.
yeah, yeah. I'm sorry, I'm gonna look at, okay, well, let me, okay, because I'm not seeing what I'm looking for. There should be, usually there's like a links thing. You know what I'm talking about, Madeline? And I don't see it.
We should have a link to it through our library webpage. I believe there's still the link to the health sciences
Here in Denver.
site, and then you would just need a login because it used to like be on our page, the password and stuff.
So
Yeah.
just type in health HS, if you put it in the,
Yeah, I know, I just don't see the box. Where's the,
no, my computer recognizes that. I think if you just put in the HTTP, HS library, it'll pop in.
oh, right, oh, shoot, I just messed it up. Sorry, you guys, hang on one second. Oh, right here.
Yeah.
What is it,
HS.
oh, there it is. Oh, I should have known. Yeah, I know, yeah. All right, let me just,
Yeah.
okay, because this is, yeah, so this is what I do, and then I go down here to PubMed. But look, these are all databases right here. Sorry, but I'm a PubMed person. And then once I go in here, okay, so you can't get to this point, or, and then,
Maybe they can't get it.
Well, it took us there because I had already logged in.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
so there's like a login
And a
page.
login.
okay, and here's Bonnie's Pubs. Okay, well, I think we should check on that. So, so let me check on that. So, because I didn't know that,
Yeah.
and I definitely want to.
Yeah, we just have
Okay.
limited access through children's. Like we have a list of all the databases when you go to our library page. But some of them you have limited, like you'll find great articles on there, but then you don't
Yeah.
have
You
access
don't
to
have
them.
access. So there's
the abstract.
occasionally, if even that doesn't have it, the university library, I'll go on Google
Mhm.
for that article and put the title, and put the title in, and occasionally I'll get it
Mhm.
for free.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
The librarians can request it and get it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
They
good.
were super helpful
They'll
and
get
just
it
sent
yeah,
it to me right away.
I know they're so yeah
Within 24 hours.
yeah they're fast. So okay, well anyway, so let me find out about the library. But just a couple of other kind of thoughts about narrowing your focus. So I get this question a lot, like especially from my students, like, well, should I only be looking at research in the last 5 years, or that I actually like reading seminal research, and I think that sometimes it's actually really important research, even if it was done 20 years ago. So it's not a straightforward answer to that question, but one way to narrow your scope, if you really, if you're getting 1,000 hits in there, is you can kind of narrow it to the last 5 to 10 years. But you may miss the older research that maybe, was done before that. So I'll just kind of throw that out. But, really, truly, the more that you read, the more that you become informed, you'll start to see more and more what you can weed out, some of the things that you should be paying attention to. Like I was telling Kristen, like if she finds a really good review paper or a paper that she wants me to read, I think we should both read it and then come back together and compare notes.
and I do this with all of my PhD students when they're probably a little overwhelmed by me, but by the end of the term, they're used to me. And hopefully they learn some things to look at, and actually they find things that I'm like, oh, I didn't pay attention to that either. But there's some value to doing that. So if you find a great paper that you would like your mentor to read, you guys could talk about that. But importantly, just before I turn this over to Madeline, there's a bunch more slides that have much more specific pointers, if that helps you. And that's something definitely, Kristen, you and I can talk about. You can talk about with your mentors, but I just want to tell all of you something that I think is sort of important. There's been an explosion of things either in PubMed or on Google Scholar or published anywhere, to the point that you can find a paper to support almost any proposition, including the Force in Star Wars, because predatory journals it's a bad joke, but didn't we see that but some guy published a paper about the Force through from Star Wars. It is bogus paper through a predatory journal, and it is out there published. You can get it through Google Scholar. So I just want you to know that's a little bit daunting, but this is why we really want to help you figure out the things to choose, okay? And this is why the strength, the quality of the evidence, this is really what we're here to help you with. Because all of you can get on Google Scholar and kind of do a lit review. But now we're really going to do a lit review, right? Mm-hmm. So to kind of get that to the next level. So, I hate to say it, but just some published papers aren't very good. And every time I teach my course in the fall with my PhD students, it's kind of disheartening. I'm trying to show them what we think is the right way to do it, and stuff gets out there, and that's on us as referees, as part of the academy. But for your purposes, we want to help you be better and really pick out some of those things that can help you understand this is a quality article. They really did do their due diligence, whether it's qualitative or exploratory or quantitative. So that's really the whole purpose of getting started and really you're taking the deep dive. You're going down. You just came down from altitude, okay? But then, right? And so this is really the time to do that. And I hope I have some fun. I mean, this is fun. This is fun. Okay. I think it's fun. Okay, but none of you are here because you don't have, hope to get some fun out of this. So anyway, all right. So I'm going to turn it over to Madeline because we don't want to, go too much over. But really, I kept some of these other slides in, knowing we wouldn't go through it all nitpicky. But there are some more pointers for you. Here, Madeline, let me.
There's two.
Oh, wait, I did it wrong. Okay, I have to share the screen, right, Madeline? Here, let me share your.
Maybe I have to do it.
Well, are you?
I'm in there.
Oh, here. Okay, she's in there. Sorry, here, let me just clean
I
that.
did this with my PhD class. I lost everybody when I tried to share. So first we pull it up.
I think it's this one right there.
Yeah, you're right. Thank you. Share. Okay. Oh, look. Maybe I did. Maybe. Okay, so I'm not. How many of you did CTEP? Almost everybody. And did you get qualitative articles in there? Have you seen qualitative articles, all of you? Not everybody. Because sometimes there are articles that you don't see as often, or maybe you don't recognize what they are. So I'm not going to tell you how to do qualitative study right now. We're just going to look at how you would review a qualitative paper. So what is it? It seeks to discover and understand concepts, phenomenon, and cultures, human experience. So this is all about experience and people's narratives. That's what qualitative research is. So you're not going to see, even in the best qualitative article, not going to see a hypothesis ever. And you're not going to see variables ever. So don't expect to see them. Don't downrate the article because you don't see those things. No statistical analysis except for demographics. So there might be a little bit in there about, 50%, were women or whatever. That is the only statistical analysis you will see. unless it's a content analysis, but I don't want to talk about those not today. Scaled and valid instruments, you're not going to see any instruments used. There's going to be no questionnaires, there's going to be nothing like that. And no really definitive conclusions. So analysis is narrative. It's themes and words. And if you've seen qualitative before, you know that that's the case. The thing that people get confused about is that descriptive research that's quantitative. So descriptive research that's quantitative is going to have numbers in it, and this will not, even though it's a type of descriptive research. Okay, just make sure you have that distinction, because I've heard even graduate students call a descriptive quantitative article qualitative. So don't do that. And then this is, what did you use in CTEP for your evidence hierarchy? This one? Melnick?
No, it's I printed it yesterday. This. Double AC.
Oh,
It's
okay.
like A, B, C, D, E.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Whatever
There's
you,
like a crosswalk.
No, so CTEP doesn't use that. They use their own one that they've
these non-X,
developed.
And then
Yeah.
children's
And then
uses
children.
this.
okay. So whatever you use,
There's actually several.
There's like a
Yeah.
crosswalk
Yeah,
of the
between
two.
the two.
Yeah.
whatever you use, where's
That
qualitative?
one's more in line with AAP. They do the ABC.
Yeah.
But where's qualitative? Oops, back. Let me go back.
It's C.
So is that like CDE?
Maybe A is the highest level, like A is meta-analysis down through like
Yeah.
B, and C
So it's-
has a lot.
It's not high.
Right. in the
C is
middle.
not high.
Yeah. it's in the
Yeah,
middle.
so whatever you look at here, it's almost at the bottom and it's just above opinion, but it isn't. This is a form of research and it's actually got its place. It's a good form of research. I consider myself a quantitative researcher, but I have done qualitative studies because I needed to. So why would you do one? Why would anybody do a qualitative study? It's near the bottom. If you talk to the physicians and say, look at all these qualitative studies I have that support what I want to do, they will say, probably. And, unless they're enlightened a little bit. But
I'll give you an example of one that was done on the May 4 pulmonary unit. It was to sort of understand barriers as to why nurses weren't speaking up when they had a gut feeling that something was wrong with their patient. What were the barriers with communicating and calling the provider? So investigators did a lot of interviewing to just sort of understand themes of
right.
why, what was the barrier between sort of escalating care.
And
So
could you
what
have
were
done
they-
that in a questionnaire? No.
Really long interviews.
Yeah. I mean, you can get some things, like your satisfaction at work.
Right.
So somebody could take that, okay, but you're not going to
Just
get,
try to understand
that-
the story.
right.
And the context.
More kind of a lived experience. So some of our new grads looked at the paternal experience with having a child in the NICU, and most all the studies they found were
qualitative, because that's kind of what it's about, is that experience. Lived experience, I want to be really careful, and I'll tell you why later, but it is, it's somebody's narratives, and they put them together and they get themes. So it has its place, and it's fun to do them, and it's fun to write them, I think. So, but they're not all good. So what I want to do is this article here, we're going to go through how to look, and you can look at the article and find what we're talking about. So this is called Nurses' Narratives of Unforgettable Patient Care Events. I want you to keep that title in mind.
Is this the one Bonnie was talking about?
No,
Oh,
this is,
okay.
it's an old
Sorry.
one.
No, but it reminded me of that
Oh,
one.
okay.
Yeah. Okay, so, except I think yours was probably better.
Well, I think it was
These
great.
people got off track. So it should have the interest, it should have a problem statement, it should have an aim. And if you look down on that first page, the specific aim of this phenomenological study. So when you talk about phenomenology, It's a certain kind of qualitative design that I don't want to talk about too much today, but it is about somebody's lived experience. The thing that it needs to have, and a lot of people call their research phenomenological because they think it sounds terrific. And they say lived experience, you know, and I don't want to do naturalist, just plain old qualitative. I'm going to do this. But what it needs to have is a philosophy talked about in the article. So these people did have one sentence, and they mentioned Husserl and who's the other one? Merleau-Ponty.
Oh,
These are people that writers use when they talk about qualitative research. The only thing is, that's the last time you hear about it. So there's a sign that perhaps they don't know what they're doing. Okay, but they do have a problem statement. They do have an aim. They have a purpose statement, which you can find. And then if you go to the methods, they should have a justification for why they use a qualitative approach. And it's almost more important with a qualitative, when you do a quantitative study, you don't say, I'm doing a quantitative study because, it's just, that's what most people do quantitative. Qualitative, you kind of have to justify why. Why do this study when you could give them questionnaires? So they need to have that. And I don't know if this one does or not, but it should have that. And then if it's phenomenology, they need to talk about it, the philosophy, a little bit, like maybe a paragraph or two. And it ought to go through the entire article. So this does not do that. You need data collection is compatible with the purpose. Well, if in qualitative, it's going to be a qualitative method if you say that's what you're going to do. And then the methods match the stated study design. And I don't want to go through this very much because we'll have another class where we talk about design a little bit. But naturalistic inquiry is what I do because that's what I know. That's the simplest form. You have questions and you ask people questions, and it's fine. It's a fine method. Don't need to do the other ones. It's okay. Grounded theory is the other paper I gave you that it comes up with a theory at the end. So they give very little lit review. Don't expect a big lit review on those. But at the end, they have a theory. Ethnography, they immerse themselves in a culture. So you could, if you're nurse and you immerse yourself in your unit and you did a study and you did multiple interviews, that could be ethnography. People do that. They go to a different culture. Like you could go to where you went. Africa, and you could stay there. And you could ask people about their health care that they get, and you could, just be one of them. And okay, so that's, and then I'd already talked about phenomenology. The data analysis should be described well so that you understand what they did. And they will usually talk about how they developed themes. Did they talk with somebody else? Did they have they will never call it inter-rater reliability because that's not a qualitative word, but they would agree. And then they would say, well, when we had a disagreement, this is how we solved it. But and then they tell you how they, if they had some bias, they would say, I have this bias, and whatever they did to get rid of it, although I don't see that much. And then, how did they get their themes? So it should be very clear to you, just as if it was a quantitative art, okay? And then they'll talk about rigor. And even though it's pretty loose, so when you do, I think I missed this one. When you do a qualitative article, you have a sample. But how do you get a sample? What's the best way to get a sample in quantitative research? Randomized. You don't, not always. I mean, you can use a convenient sample. Qualitative is different. They can use convenient sample. It's absolutely fine. They can use purposive sampling, which means like, you know, I could ask Christine, say, Christine, why don't you tell me about breastfeeding in the NICU and your experiences with it? And you would talk about it. And I'd say to you, who else could I talk to? And you'd say, Marianne. And I would say, okay, I'll talk to her. So you can get somebody just to recommend, and that's perfectly fine. You can pick people who you think will talk to you,
Right.
because there's nothing worse than doing an interview and say, tell me, you know, how was that experience? Oh, it's good.
Yeah, right, yeah.
So sometimes you kind of look for people that are going to talk to you. Okay, that's okay. All that's okay. You don't have, you know, in quantitative, and I don't know if you know this yet, but you do a power analysis to see what your sample size should be. In qualitative research, when you start hearing the same thing over and over again, you can stop. And so if they don't have a big sample and they don't justify the sample except to say, well, we started hearing the same thing, or, you know, saturation was reached, that's okay. Anything else? It's much looser. Like I say, you don't have statistics to worry about. You don't have instruments that you need to figure out, are they valid, reliable, anything. But you should know what questions they ask. And they should have one or two global questions or primary questions. And then if they have to probe a little bit for something, they will. It's not a standardized questionnaire at all. You have your primary questions, and then you might have some things that you're going to ask. But you don't have to necessarily stick to it. You know, they can change as they go along and hear what people say, and they can say, well, we need to ask this now. So that's okay. In this study, they went off track. So I want you to look at the title. The question, what they wanted to know, let's look at the purpose statement. They wanted to know what a typical day was for a nurse. That's what they wanted to know. And they asked, what did you ask? Somehow, when they asked the question, they didn't get that. And people started not talking about their typical day. They started talking about the worst patient they ever had. So instead of bring over, to what's your typical day, they let them talk about this patient. Mm-hmm. And then they must have changed the whole thing, their whole question, everything, because what they came out with was people's awful event. So, yeah. And so I would say that this article, that they went off track, and this probably isn't a very good article, and perhaps these people didn't know what they were doing. Mm-hmm. So the other thing that would be a big signal is if they start using statistical terms, or terms like generalizability, or statistical analysis. If you see those kinds of words, they probably don't know what they're doing. And even in qualitative research, you need somebody to mentor. You need to do it right. Yeah. So just be aware of some of those things when you're looking at qualitative.
Maybe one other thing about purposive sampling. Like if you're doing a qualitative study, you have inclusion and exclusion criteria, and you kind of want everybody to look the same so you can measure things precisely. And in the purposive sampling with qualitative, you try to identify people who will tell you something different. So maybe different age groups, different ethnicities, different whatever, a broader perspective of the problem from different people's views. So if it was on parenting, maybe a single parent, maybe older parents, maybe teenage parents, you want to get a broader sample.
But it's loose, it doesn't have the same rules that a quantitative study will have. But they still should put in, what kind of you can still put in your inclusion and exclusion. Because you are still going to be looking probably for a certain kind of person, certain people who are breastfeeding in the NICU, people who are nurses in the psych unit, those kinds of things. So you still are going to have that sample. And then this rigor. So something should be said about maybe not all of these things, but at least some of them. So credibility. The participants recognize the experience as their own. So what you can do is when they're done with the interview, the researcher will say, well, this is what I heard you say. Is this right? Is this, did I hear it right? Is this what you mean? Dependability or auditability. The reader can follow the researcher's thinking. So then researchers should explain how they came about their themes. The same thing with quantitative. The method should be able to be repeated, so you need to understand what they did. Confirmability. So the analysis is done that keeps researchers' bias, assumptions, and perspectives separate. You're supposed to, I haven't seen that done. You're supposed to actually mention that and say, well, I thought that, whatever you thought. I thought that mothers who stop breastfeeding are terrible. I don't think that, but I'm just, but then you're supposed to put that in. Okay. But I have not, I don't think I've ever seen that done. Yeah. Transferability is like generalizability, but the generalizability word should not be used. But that's kind of, can these findings be applicable outside where they did the research? Are they meaningful to individuals who wouldn't be involved in research? And that's what that is, transferability.
Usually you do this by providing those demographics that Madeline talked about, so you know exactly who you interviewed. And so people can say, oh, well, my population is similar to that, so maybe this would also apply to them.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the findings should be presented within the context. These are the same pretty much as you'd see with quantitative, a good quantitative articles. The reader should be able to understand the essence. Bonnie was talking about one that she read where she cried when every time she reads it because she could feel herself in that situation. And again, same as with quantitative. And in the discussion, the researcher should connect findings to other research. The reader can place the conclusions, implications, and findings to the context. The conclusions don't go outside of the study findings. And people will say, well, I did my study and everybody should do this because my group said they liked it. And then they go on and on and on about what this should be, should be. So entirely out of context. It's not what they found out by their research. It's just other people's research or something they think should happen just because. So it needs to stay true to the results, true to the findings. And then, of course, you need to connect it to nursing and practice. So, yeah, that's it. Does that help a little bit? How many of you have read quantitative and used it for your? Anybody? What?
You mean qualitative?
That's what I meant, qualitative. Yeah. Not many. You really haven't found, I'm surprised you haven't found any.
I did find one.
Yeah.
Full article.
Yeah. Yeah. So you might. Depends.
Another thing I was thinking, when Madeline was talking about saturation and qualitative research, okay, the more, because remember we talked about how wide do you cast the net, how much do you read, you will reach saturation.
Mm-hmm.
And not in the qualitative sense, but in other words, you'll start seeing a lot of the same references over and over again. And you'll basically what you're reading, you're not running into anything new. That's a good sign that that you're starting to have read enough to, to really know what's out there. What were you gonna say?
I was just thinking of ED. I remember what I know you were doing the suicide.
Well, I know hormone syndrome, and I'm afraid that I came into this with the intention of being very data, scientific, quantitative, but I don't. But now,
Because are you working on like barriers of why people aren't doing
I thought you were gonna do it both.
Or what are you?
Well, my question is, what is really the nurse's perception of suicide screening in a pediatric ED?
Yeah, it
Which
sounds
sounds
like a
So I
qualitative.
was just while you were talking, I
Yeah.
was thinking of her.
Well,
Yeah.
what that is, but it's kind of what like it, but maybe it's probably ways that
Well, we'll go through the methods, and
it's
it
really one
can
of
help
something
you.
that's measurable. I know the experience. I need it.
But sometimes,
I
don't
want
I
to
would say that there's always mixed methods.
Yeah.
And that comes
That's
in with, so you send out a survey and you get the, the overall gist of what people are doing. And you can ask some open-ended questions if you want.
Yeah.
But if you really want to understand what the barriers are to screening in the ED, you could do some interviews to complement it.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, that's what mine usually, a lot of times is. It's like, I did a kangaroo care holding study in the NICU years ago, and people stopped doing it after the study. And I thought, well, why did they stop? They seemed to like it. Well, how else could I find out except by asking them?
Yeah, right.
I guess mine is more, I'm interested to know by perception, like, do they perceive suicide screening to be an important part of their job as an ED nurse? I already know they are uncomfortable with it, most of them.
Okay.
But I don't know how that fits into quantitative. I want them to be able to say, well, I didn't think it was important, but now I get it, because it's kids that are
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or could you devise an intervention that would convince them they need to do it and feel
Right.
comfortable with it? So that's another.
outside of discipline.
Yeah.
We're not doing that.
Well, that's what Mallory.
They're doing it, actually, we're at 90+% compliant, so if they are doing it, they just follow.
Well, Mallory's got the retention problem, and from her exit interviews, has almost qualitative data that she used for an intervention.
Like pediatric suicide screening is not new, but it's becoming more prevalent, and not a lot of EDs do it. And so, like, it's, and the barriers with it are, I don't know. I'm injecting my own results of my own study.
I thought of something that stuck with me that you said earlier, like what's the end game in mind? So like what would you hope to see, right? Like so thinking vision tracing that way.
At the end and
Yeah.
That the nurses are really comfortable, so you see the value and are really comfortable with asking it to have better outcomes for patients, right? So then I don't know, maybe work that way.
We did a 24-site trial of training providers in school-based health centers on doing a better job with implementing the guidelines for obesity screening and counseling. And we found particularly with the overweight and obese providers, they were not comfortable talking to these families. And after the intervention, that improved.
So I did find this article, and it's the Pediatric Emergency Medicine Physician's Current Practices and Beliefs Regarding Mental Health Screening. But it's, it's not qualitative. They have lots of graphs and numbers and data in here. They figured they have
Physician for you.
We look to see how they turn it into a quantitative thing.
Yeah, right.
Adapt their needs.
Or mixed method, mixed method isn't bad. Laura, you're going to talk about that next time, right?
Yeah. So next time, actually, Madeline and I are both going to be at a meeting. So that stinks. So we'll be at a nursing meeting. Actually,
it'll be good. It's WIN.
It's the WIN meeting. So actually, there's a lot of children's folks going. But Bonnie and Scott will be here, and we were hoping that over the next couple of weeks, now that we've kind of talked today, that you could. I know you probably already got started because I'm suspecting most of you in the room are type A. Just saying. But really now maybe try it again, or I don't know, maybe pay different attention now that